Singularity. What is it all about? The ethics of sublimation. What is that all about? Is it good? Or is it whack?
So since we've covered kind of most of the things around like Badiou and Zizek, and we're going to keep talking about them, I'm just going to touch on a couple of extra notes that I have in these two sections, because chapter 3 is basically her engagement with Zizek, chapter 4 is her engagement with Badiou. I mean, she does talk a little bit about the Sinthome in chapter 3, and I just have a note that just says Sinthome time, and I have it trademarked.
Sinthome time.
But basically, so we've talked about the Sinthome here and there, but basically, for anyone that doesn't remember, the Sinthome is what she describes as the tight knot of jouissance that encloses the subject's fundamental fantasy. And it's really important to remember that the fundamental fantasy is not amenable to the talking cure, because it does not exist in the realm of like the imaginary or the symbolic. It's like it is in the real.
Yeah.
And so there's a way that it like links all these things together, and it's very much part of Lacan's later theorizing.
Yeah, you could think, just to like expand on that, you could think of this idea of the Sinthome in relation to the idea of the symptom in Freud, right? And the symptom is just like the way in which we have access to this repetition compulsion in the subject, whereas the Sinthome in Lacan is kind of like his discussion of how that compulsion to repeat can become the actual substance of their life in a way that you no longer have access to as an analyst, and you can no longer sort of disambiguate from its signifiers and its like symbolic content, but rather have to sort of accept as like a constitutive feature of the subject themselves. And so anyway, Sinthome, yeah.
And I think in this chapter, we kind of mentioned that she isn't just critiquing Zizek, she's also critiquing Lee Edelman's idea of like the queer subject and its relationship to the real, and this place of subjective destitution. So I think that for people like Edelman, there's this idea that like utopian strivings are just imaginary fantasies of healing the constitutive trauma like wound that we talked about. Like there is no final signifier. And so his critique of all of that, and I think his idea of what the subject is what he calls like the synthomosexual. And so it's the idea that like the queer subject is like the embodiment of this synthomatic.
They are antithetical to everything about their ability to relate to the socio-symbolic order. They are the material representative of the negative in our society.
Yeah, I think like the material representative of the negative is exactly a really perfect way to put it. And so she kind of links together Edelman's position for like the synthomosexual with Zizek's position of like this like radical,
subjectively destitute ethical act.
So I think I just wanted to like touch on like that's just like a little bit of how she's conceptualizing Zizek's position, and that the ethical act and revolutionary politics are disruptive of the social order and becoming what one is versus relationships between others and standard ethics. And that, so she basically says too that like there is this way that like the constitutive trauma and the access to the signifier create this condition where the political and the ethical act emerge when the possibility of polite negotiation is no longer possible. Yeah, and that like for Ruti, her reading of Lacan's notion of ethical acts and desire actually offer two options as a response to the social order's trauma and violence. So one, you can either disrupt that order from a place of subjective destitution, but the other option is to also create from zero, that like the creation of new possibilities or the possibility of new possibilities. So to create from zero and create or shape new points du capiton, which is the quilting point in Lacan. So that's just a few extra things about Zizek, but just for chapter 4, it's called The Possibility of the Impossible, where she really engages with Badiou. You know, we've talked a lot about Badiou in events, so I don't feel like we kind of need to rehash that.
It's like the 4 domains, you know, like politics and love and whatever. Like, you know, shit.
This is great because we can just listen to our episodes on Badiou where we talk about
listen to the Badiou episode and you'll be caught up. She talks about the difficulty in sustaining like one's fidelity to truth through the Badiouian event, and kind of like compares and contrasts that to Zizek. And she talks about how there's still a dimension within the signifier that can be sort of malleable or plastic in a certain sense, that, you know, maybe she thinks that Zizek's interpretation or even Badiou's interpretation sort of fall short of like highlighting, and that's why she kind of ends up in the Santner camp about like being able to invoke that emancipatory potential of the signifier itself and not allowing that symbolic dimension to disclose the subject's emancipatory potential just by sake of being there. You know,
exactly.
That doesn't determine you in a sense to like fall victim to the symbolic or something.
I also think that one of her interesting like critiques of Badiou's position of like the event and like the subject's relation to it is also how do we understand like what is an event, a capital E event versus a simulacrum of an event, or like what is a true event versus a false event. And I think that to me that was actually like a really interesting like critique to think about, right?
My notes for this, it says, because it's for that section, it's called the event versus a simulacrum. I think it's in chapter 4. I'm not really sure, but basically my notes say the truth event is sustained by one's commitment to it, for Badiou, as though when one concedes their faith in the cause, that is also the collapse of its evental dimension. And it says, when you are fidelitous to the event, the daemon wins, and when you falter, the vampire wins. And then it says, do you feel like you're reading a self-help book yet? Jesus, like, I don't know what the fuck I was on at this point. But yeah, in a sense, you know, she's kind of defining that difference between a fidelitous, or a subject being fidelitous to an event and a subject experiencing a simulacrum of an event as like their way. And this is once again my criticism of her using the centenarian description, is that she kind of talks about it as though it's like the way in which you let the daemon guide you towards the truth of your ethics, or like towards the ethics of truth that you should have interpreted from the event, and it's your fidelity to that, the guiding that the daemon gives you, that like makes the event truthful as opposed to makes you the subject of a simulacrum of an event.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of, I don't know, it's a little ambiguous, I would say. It doesn't really
I think it is, yeah.
clear up the, because I mean, you and I in the Badiou episode obviously talked about this for a long time, of that there's like this dimension in event for Badiou that makes it really difficult for like you as a subject to like be able to interpret when you experienced an event and when you're just like fucking, you know, enraptured by the stupid bullshit around you, you know, and like,
well, and I think one of the responses we had, or someone I think responded to our episode and was like, thought that what we were saying is we didn't understand what Badiou's 4 areas or like 4 locations of events could be. And it's like, no, we understand what they are just fine, but that doesn't solve the problem of how you distinguish between like an event and a simulacrum of an event.
Right. And I think that this also invokes one of those dimensions in this whole problem that may be sort of endemic to this entire work, and just like the conversation around psychoanalysis in general, that there needs to be a bridging between the subject, or like the analysand, the discourse of like the clinician, and the discourse of like the political, or like the socio-cultural historical. That like this may be the pitfall of like the Badiouian event, is that we don't have a way to differentiate between an event proper that like happens sort of like politically, and I know there's like different domains of the event, obviously, once again, but like, you know, something that happens outside of the domain of the subject, or like accesses the beyond, and the way that the subject is implicated in the actually truly ethical, and relating that back to like a version of subjective experience that we can like universalize, or that we can talk about in like explicit terms. We just can't, because it's specifically the dimension of the subjective that gets lost when we have like a truth event that becomes a truth event proper, right? In the larger sense of like not just your subjective engagement with your life world, but rather you accessing the infinite, right? It's almost like your subjectivity is something that has to be sacrificed in that relation, and therefore your ability to describe what the like minutia of like encountering the event is for a subject is like impossible to enumerate. And so yeah, maybe there's something to be talked about there. But anyway, listen to the Badiou episode to get a better idea of what we're talking about here. But yeah, she definitely addresses it in chapter 4 and kind of tries to get at it, but I don't know if she fully answers the question.
Yeah, I don't think she does. I mean, one thing I will say here is that she kind of also talks about some of Zizek's critiques of Badiou, but I think where she eventually comes down is to say that like for both Badiou and Zizek, despite his critiques of Badiou, she both sees them as both endorsing Lacan's concept of the Tuche, that the encounter with the real can partially name this event to bring its energies into contact with the symbolic and bring about social transformation. So for her, what she's, I think, going to emphasize in this like Satinarian kind of way as well is what Lacan called like an ethics of sublimation, that she sees as going further than both Zizek or Badiou, and to bring about both personal and social transformation. And so I think she sees the ethics of sublimation as being the link between like where there is that leap from the individual and like, you know, in the analysand, or right, like whatever, like on the couch, to some sort of like social transformation. But then in part 2, we're going to talk about that this is the way to make that link, or does she successfully make the link, I think.
Yeah, and just to reiterate the difference that she sees between Zizek and Badiou, she's saying that for Badiou, there is an aspect of having fidelity to the truth event that eventually has you add a name to what the event consisted of that like sort of then can be reintegrated and accepted as like a progressive direction for politics or for history or for whatever art or love, and that like Zizek sort of says no, that naming the event would be a betrayal of its evental legitimacy
and almost created as like a site of terror.
Yeah, and that it would then become like the sort of pantsuit nation version of like liberal democracy that like imposes on you that you must now become subject to its like rule of law. And you know, it's almost like that. Zizek sees the dimension in this naming that could become oppressive just as much as like what we see as the thing we're trying to emancipate ourselves from,
exactly.
right, in through the event. And so it's just
and
sort of like
obviously
this
talk about like Stalin,
going ad nauseum,
like Mao,
Stalin,
like
Mao,
the
everything.
The standard fucking examples of whenever the event eventually turns into this, naming it turns into the legitimation of the social order that creates it as a site of terror.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, and then she follows up that section with the section called The Lures of Power, and then goes on to like talk kind of like about how, you know, this can create that problem of the totalitarianism inherent to the Emancipatory Act. And so anyway, but that's pretty much all that I've really got on all of that, you know, preceding part 2.
So let's go ahead and do part 2, chapter 5, the jouissance of the signifier.
Yeah.
So, I mean, first couple of notes I have is that Ruti says that when regarding the real as unassimilable, man, I cannot like just use words today. When regarding the real as assimilable to the symbolic, we tend to valorize a purity with regard to ethics and politics, and the only real politics is quote unquote a politics of the real, which she sees as being by definition non-intersubjective in its orientation towards ethics and politics. So basically she says it's like Antigone in her cave, like it's this complete divorcing of the subject from the intersubjective bedrock that creates it. I mean, I also thought like one of the interesting things here, she said there are two primary ethical responses to oppressive social systems. So one, to subvert and reconstitute them, which would be something like Judith Butler and her drawing on Foucault. And then the other option is going to be a revolutionary politics and change, which is like Zizek via Lacan.
Yeah.
So again, kind of, I think it's just, for me, it was like helpful of like whichever one you come down on, just clearly stating like these are two different ways to respond to this, or two different answers to these questions, I think was like really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, this is the section of the book where I
just see walls of text on
it is notes. It's walls of text and it's all big mad. And I think my contention here is it's along the lines of how she is backpedaling from Zizek's addressing of the question of violence. And I think that what she's really getting at here is that, you know, literally, this is a line from my notes. Everybody out here too afraid to talk about the real of violence. And when Zizek identifies too directly with the necessity of violence, it generates discomfort in this life-affirming perspective. And like, I know that Ruti takes the like prospect of violence seriously. Whether it be, you know, this idea of sort of like symbolic rupture, or whether it be like actually like ethical acts in the world that consist of violent things. I think that she's addressing it directly, but in a sense, she's trying to situate herself as like, you know, maybe this is what we were getting at earlier in part 1, where we were talking about the sort of like liberal tendency that might be interpreted in the political implications of what Ruti is talking about. But like that basically what she's trying to do is like caution us against certain form of radical violence or like subjective engagement with violent acts, even towards the symbolic, in favor of like maybe trying to find some compromise, you know, between us and our interpretation of what we conceive of as our signifiers. And so
let me say this, because I actually think this is one of the strongest criticisms I had of Ruti on the second time reading it, prepping for the episode, because since reading it the first time, I've done a lot of like really sustained reading and engagement with Walter Benjamin, right? Like from my own writing on the like Capillaries blog. But I actually think that this is a really, really common mistake. and a common simplification I've seen in a lot of different psychoanalytic or even like leftist, like radical thinkers. So she kind of is like critiquing Zizek's book In Defense of Lost Causes and him invoking divine violence. But I think one of the things that is always missed is that whenever Benjamin talks about divine violence, he's directly counterposing it to what he calls mythic violence, which is the idea that the social order to continue existing as it is built on immense violence.
Yeah.
But this violence is what he calls mythic. It's like this violence that is recreating like the myth of like the social order of the state, right? So he counterposes divine violence not as violence that reacts or like does like destructive acts against like a fairly stable, like non-violent social order.
Right.
It's really a question of like which violence are we going to align ourselves with, because they're both operating all the time. Like we have a choice between one or the other.
Right.
And
it's sort of like the property is theft logic of like what is the stealing of like someone's, value, their money or something compared to like the founding of a bank, right? Like the utter violence that is endemic to the just like the prescription of the idea of property in the first place is already like the backdrop against which we are acting ethically. So to conceive of our violence as being the same type or of the same character as like that which we are oppressed, the violence that we are oppressed by is like a misnomer, right? Like, it's putting us on the wrong side of what's really going on.
Well, and I think this could be one of the liberal kind of political assumptions in the background is like, despite her talk about like oppressive social systems and the possibility of like gendered and racialized violence, there is a certain way that I think Ruti is in critiquing violence this way, or the idea that like, she basically says, to force an encounter with the real is to betray the event, right? Like that's what creates violence in the way that she's critiquing is like whenever you're trying to like, without the sort of contingency of like how like the world actually is, like you're trying to bring about the real in itself. And that's what leads to violence, which is like, okay, fine. I could kind of understand that. But her like assumption in like critiquing divine violence in this way, the way that Zizek invokes it, is I think, to whether she realizes it or not, is to, essentially say, well, yes, of course, like there can be gendered violence and racialized violence, but it's in some way to like, I don't know, like maybe obscure the fact that like the whole nature of like imperialism and like the state, like the nation state in itself is built on tremendous violence. The whole social order period is built on the use of violence or the threat of violence for the sake of like the social order continuing.
Right. The creation of the myths of race, the creation of the myths of like the gendered like expectations and like, patriarchy and all those kinds of things. It's like that is the violence, right? I think I in my notes, I kind of talk about how, although, because this is one of my criticisms, I think that because she kind of situates Zizek in her argument as being someone who's advocating for like this sort of like ultimate violence of subjective destitution in the ethical act, right? But then I kind of counterpose that to contextualize, because then I'm just sort of like, look, like, maybe he insists that the ethical act is this sort of like radically unrestricted or like ethicality or like fidelity to this act that you consider to be ethical. But to conceive of that as violence in the same way that Zizek thinks of violence is a misnomer, right? Like Zizek talks about, like, for example, when he talks about like a legitimate authority, right? He talks about how an authority committing an act of violence in order to support its authority or its rule is instantly basically like showing its impotence as an authority and delegitimizing itself. So like he has this argument that like the importance of like towing that line is what creates a legitimate authority. A legitimate authority functions on the promise of violence or consequences, but absolutely never compromises on their desire to like enforce that violence. And that he sort of has this almost ethics of like when you take power to like only invoke that power in the like sort of potentialities of punishment and never to actually like that every violation of the rules has to always sort of take on this character of being exceptional so that you never have to like collapse your authority into some kind of oppressive use of violence to like maintain order, social order. And so there's like some discrepancies there, right? Like Zizek doesn't always just like advocate for a certain kind of violence in that sense, right? The violence that he's advocating for, like his relation to the symbolic that he describes in the subject, is not necessarily like something that you can collapse into his idea of like violence being legitimate, right? There's a lot more to be discussed there. And so that kind of made me feel like she was being a little opportunistic in like sort of situating her stance as being criticism of Zizek when she's sort of decontextualizing some of his argumentation for like the purposes of, and I think it gets once again back to the heart of this matter of like, are we talking about the subject, or are we talking about the sort of legitimacy of the power structure, or like the state that will be to come, right? Yeah. Of like, once ethicality has been imposed in the world and we're all acting with fidelity to the event of truth, what will that world look like versus what the world of like the subject looks like now, where we're trying to like determine whether our acts can be emancipatory or have that sort of revolutionary potential, and like not wanting to sacrifice our relationship to the symbolic in doing something ethical. Yeah. So,
well, I think it like kind of an interesting thing here, just to kind of get back on my notes a little bit, is, you know, the reason why she calls this chapter the jouissance of the signifier is because for her, like, the activation of the real can come through this like subjective destitutional exit from the symbolic, but it can also come from recognizing and mobilizing what she calls the overabundance of the signifier, which is where this like ethics of sublimation comes in.
Plasticity.
Yeah, the plasticity of it. And I would just say, like, in my reading of like Walter Benjamin, mobilizing the overabundance of the signifier against the symbolic is in itself divine violence. Like, divine violence is that very act.
Exactly. Yeah. And in a sense, that discrepancy between her perspective and that of Zizek, which she's kind of arguing throughout, I think that the way that I wrote about it in my notes is kind of like Zizek arguing from the position of the person who has experienced the fallout of like having tried to commit to some kind of truth of event, or like the sort of subjective destitution that might come from like challenging academia or like putting yourself out there in like a political message, and then having the backlash of that not function, and like you being like the laughing stock, right? And like maybe cautioning against a certain compromising of values in the face of that, those repercussions or those consequences that come from the act, as opposed to Mary Ruti, who's maybe being like, no, go for it, it's gonna be great, you know, like, this is the only like access to the infinite that we have, so just like embrace it and go for it, accept the miracle, and like not emphasizing the consequence, right? And so it's almost like two sides of the same coin, right? Like, you have Zizek, who kind of has a pessimistic attitude of like, this is going to turn out badly for you, even though it's the only right thing for you to do. Yeah. Whereas you have Ruti kind of being like, yeah, it's going to turn out badly, but come on, it's the only right thing to do. You got to do it. And it's going to be great. But it's going to, you know, like, it's going to change things. And that, like, she's sort of invoking the positive consequences that could arise, which I feel like is a little disingenuous, maybe, especially for a subject that's struggling with these things. And then she goes on to start talking about James Joyce and Lacan, and that's when I was just like, whoa, like, there's a totally different context for this.
I mean, maybe let's talk about that, because I think this will also lead to something that for me is like really relevant and personal about her discussion about jouissance and language, and like jouissance and the signifier. So she basically talks about the final phase of Lacan's work no longer opposing language and jouissance, which in earlier phases it kind of did, but says that the signifier remains creative to the extent that it transmits jouissance. And so basically this is where the Sinthome is so relevant, because the Sinthome, and using Joyce and invoking Joyce as like an example of the Sinthome, is precisely in his way of relating to language and writing. And so she basically says the Sinthome makes polyvalence possible, and it forces both the real and the signifier to adapt. That the subject becomes the active constructor / shaper of meaning versus some passive recipient of hegemonic meanings. I don't know. Do you want to just go ahead and like get big mad about her reading of Joyce?
So I think once again, this is an instance where I agree with like Rudi's overall sort of like discussion of like jouissance in the signifier and like its potential. But I think that especially in this instance, she is sort of decontextualizing Zizek's perspective as like a straw man for like a certain kind of criticism of like that perspective that I don't feel like is fair to Zizek. And once again, that's my boy.
It's pure ideology.
And like, I'm always gonna fucking like, you know, like, and this is just
your reputation in the Red Library canon has been well established. I
think
everyone
everyone knows. Like, if you don't know this by now, I'm sorry. Like, ask somebody. But like, basically, like, I am just like, my perspective is that Zizek's entire discussion of Joyce is it just starts from a different starting point. Like, basically, Zizek's appraisal of Joyce, which I don't know, you know, how familiar people are with this, but like, he takes Joyce and he says, look, the truth of Joyce was in Dubliners. And like Dubliners as like, you know, his like compilation of short stories that were all written beautifully and have like this deep, expressive like discussion of like the contemporary attitudes of like people in the world at that time. And like, it was a flop. Like it was like a complete failure as a book, and no one wanted to fucking read it. And so Joyce then was like, fuck the free world, and just started writing in this like stream of consciousness kind of way. And that like as a result, like accidentally had his rails lead him to the place where he was expecting to go, which is a miracle. Right. And so in a sense, it confirms all of these things, the centenarian and like what Ruti is arguing about singularity and the subject and like all these things. It is a coincidence, and it is like him following his daemon or whatever. But to say that Zizek doesn't argue this exact same thing in the opposite way is like it's like a mischaracterization of Zizek's argument. Right. Like Zizek is saying that in his absolute rejection of the socio-symbolic through the subjective destitution of his like actual style, which is present in Dubliners, you see Joyce actually attain massive success through this like miraculous acceptance of like his way of writing as like the next phase in like the modern or something, you know? And like, you know, he absolutely says that this was like Joyce basically acting in defiance of what he had ascertained to be the socio-hegemonic like world that he was writing into. And so I think that there's no lack of coincidence between Zizek's perspective on this and Ruti's perspective on this, that like what she's arguing about in Lacan and sort of the like jouissance of the signifier and the ability to exploit that to sort of like create new paths is like absolutely what Zizek talks about in Joyce. He just talks about it in this way of like Joyce's ethical act is not like in his continuation to write crazy bullshit like Finnegan's Wake and Ulysses. It's more like his ethical act is in breaking with the socio-symbolic nature of his writing that you can see exemplified in something like Dubliners, which failed miserably. And he, in his escape from that domain of like being interpolated by a certain dimension of the real, and just like accepting his like ethical like position and like and writing, you know, and just writing for what he fucking thought. It was almost like his way of relating to his writing was facetious, or was like,
yeah,
you know.
I guess I would say like my understanding of Ruti in this chapter is not so much about her critique of Zizek, and I'll be honest, I don't necessarily like think we should. I mean, I don't necessarily want it to be like let's just stage a debate between Zizek and Ruti,
right?
Per se,
which I have been doing the entire time.
Yeah, which is fine,
you know,
but I think it's good.
I think
right?
that's why I was big mad, was because I feel like she picked a bone with Zizek to have, and Badiou and Santner and like all the other thinkers, Butler and all these people that she's invoking.
Yeah, like people who are into like Derrida and like post-structure. I mean, she's like after everybody.
Yeah, and so in a sense, she's using these criticisms or like these differentiations of her own perspective away from the established order. Maybe you could say the vampires of like, you know, these like carriers of the sedimentation of knowledge. And she's using it to sort of structure her work. But in a sense, I think her work has the potential to be standalone, and like she's actually finding more support and more like of a like getting her bearings from like these other thinkers than she is differentiating herself from them.
Yeah.
And so
I mean, it's narcissism with small differences in a lot of ways.
Right. I just found it to be like a little bit unnecessary. Why situate yourself against all these thinkers? Your space is already carved out in the substance of what you're arguing for. They actually give you all the support that you need to like be able to carve the space out, right? And so it's like in the same way that she's criticizing the like typical understanding of the subject, she is committing the same sort of fallacy in her relation to like
she's still
the
an
symbolic
academic.
order. Yeah,
she's still an academic, but like I think like so that's like the defense of Zizek, but I think it is important just to like clearly say like this is what her criticism is, which I don't necessarily think is about Joyce as an ethical subject. I think it's the way that we conceptualize the relationship between the signifier and the real. Yeah. So she basically says that for Zizek, he does not distinguish between the signifier as an element of hegemony and oppression versus an element of resistance. And she has this quote where he says that like Zizek sees language as static and dead, that like parasitizes life and doesn't necessarily like relate to them. Zizek doesn't necessarily conceptualize it in the way that she is doing when she invokes the Sinthome, which is basically that she says that we play with either denying the existence of the big other through subjective destitution, or we can do it by playing with the inconsistency of the other, because the other, there is no other of the other, right? Like the other is also something that is like fractured and cut. But I think what's interesting about this is she says that like the signifier is rebellious because the real is rebellious, because in the way that she's describing the Sinthome, like they're not these like oppositional sorts of things, right? That in later Lacan, it's like they're kind of shot through with each other, like they're relating in a different way. So, you know, I think it's up to each person maybe to like figure out where they come down on like this sort of debate, right? Of like, is this an accurate read of Zizek, you know, or like, is Ruti reading the Sinthome in the way that is like accurate or like makes sense? I mean, you know, I think that's up to everyone else to decide who is engaging with it. But I do think that that's like the distinguishing of the positions, as she's saying, like, this is very much about, are you interpreting the relationship between the real and the signifier versus from this like earlier Lacanian sort of like period, or in this later period of the Sinthome? And I think she's trying to at least say like she's aligning with the Sinthome, and I think that's what gives her basis of her argument, that there is this way that we can like engage with the symbolic and like affect the order and like create new possibilities. It's because essentially like because there's an inconsistency of the other, and that's something that we can like creatively engage with.
Yeah. Here's a quote. It's from the top of 122. She says, it's kind of talking in the same vein. Likewise, the idea that symbolic subjectivity represses the asocial energies of the real cannot be remedied by a theory that completely annihilates the social in favor of the real, for this merely reverses the poles of the binary, replacing one form of brutality by another. And then she says, this incidentally is one of the problems with Zizek's notion of divine violence as a response to the systemic violence of the establishment. And then she says, I have demonstrated that moments when the real penetrates the symbolic are not necessarily indicative of the failure of signification, but rather of its irrepressible agility. Okay, and then she goes on. Yeah, I guess in my head, I fully agree. But like, you know, like saying, like my criticism that I was saying here was basically like, if there's anyone who like embodies that sort of like divine violence, it's fucking Joyce. Like Joyce is like absolutely the like subject of that divine violence par excellence, right? Like he's like the guy that went against the sort of violence of the hegemony of fucking language and how we were supposed to be using it. And
like all of Ulysses was like a trolling of like literary critics. And
literary critics will have something to work on for the next 200 years or whatever the fuck he said. And then as an addition to this, on page 126, she actually kind of confesses, let me thing that I was trying to capture in what she's saying here of this chapter on page 126. She goes from saying that there's like this like inevitability of defiance in like Joyce's use of language, and like she's kind of using it to argue like that sort of jouissance in the signifier and like all this stuff. And then she kind of says, like, I think this is the quote that I was trying to get at. She said, I would say that any language, this is a quote from the top of 26, I would say that any language that makes us question our assumptions, allows us to think in original ways, disrupts the monotony of the status quo, moves us emotionally, makes us sit up and pay attention, or exhibits the kind of creative suppleness that allows us to reinvent a slice of the world, is singularizing. And so
I would also describe that as being divinely violent.
Right, exactly. I'm like, are you not just confessing that, like, in a sense, that this is what we're supposed to be trying to do? And like, I just don't see where the necessity of like criticizing all these other thinkers that are basically in general agreement with you is necessary. And I
do think that like that quote is a really indicative one, right? Because that might be, there's this hesitancy to like take that leap to say like this in itself is like divinely violent. I think maybe is related to her underlying like political assumptions or the implications of this, which are like, again, set up this like liberal opposing distinction, which is a false one, of like, well, there is peace and there is violence. And the point is like, no, like they're both endemic. It's a question of like, which one do we align ourselves with? Yeah.
And I also found, and then in that, just to invoke that quote again, I also found that once again is like in the back of my head going, those like fucking big red alarms going off of like, that is the kind of thing that somebody who was like absolutely situated within the first world liberal viewpoint, that like I can engage in like diversity of tactics, and like me, you know, painting flowers in my notebook and like sharing it on Instagram is actually me engaging in like some kind of like divine violence and like some like jouissance of the signifier. It's like, no, you know, like, no, it's not, you're not, stop, you know, like, what are you doing? And like, in a sense, I feel like it's those moments in this work that I key in on and go like, who are you defending the subject from? Right. And I think that at the end of the day, it really comes down to like, maybe that like ethics of responsibility that might be in like a certain kind of existentialist position, right? Of like, that's all that we're really dealing with, is like the deep degree to which like our responsibility is ours to bear, and that we're not engaging with it in the ways that we should be, and we construct lives around how we shouldn't engage with it, or that we, you know, that denial of that responsibility. And so,
well, I will say, like, on this note, let's move into chapter 6, which is called The Dignity of the Thing, because I think we're already like hinting at this, which is like, for her, this like setting up of how she relates the signifier and the real and the Sinthome is basically a way to say that the aliveness of language signals our proximity to Das Ding. And that for her, the ethics of the sublime is in the way that we relate to language to recreate possible ways to encounter the lost object or Das Ding. So basically the idea here is that, we're replacing the sort of like emptiness and the void of like the destitute subject, right, with a polyvalence of signs. And basically that searching for the sublimity of the lost object does in fact grant us satisfaction. Again, I think contra to like McGowan, even though she doesn't invoke McGowan's name here, but I think this is directly in contrast to McGowan's position in a lot of ways, that searching for the sublimity of the lost object does in fact grant us satisfaction because when we encounter it, it offers us a muted imprint of the lost object. So I think that that's kind of like the stakes here, like why she stakes her claim in like Das Ding, is to basically say that, like, I think the way that she's constructing her whole argument is very much about, you have to be able to set up this, like, this sort of, the overabundance of the signifier. I think she has to set it up that way to say that, like, it is precisely whenever we understand the signifier as having this overabundance as well as, like, it can operate as this, like, oppressive hegemonic kind of function of the other and the symbolic. It's precisely whenever you like can set it up as also having this other overabundant function, and that fantasy can also have this like life-giving sort of quality that we then all of a sudden can really focus and I think conceptualize what Das Ding is and like how we relate to it and what it's how it's sort of like can create this ethics of sublimation in her perspective.
Yeah. Okay. So in the dignity of the thing, this chapter, once again, invoking my big mad energy, I'm just going to like talk about a little bit about what I got from this. And maybe it would be better for us to go through some of the like things she brings up in this chapter prior to me criticizing it ruthlessly. But like, I don't know that she's bringing up a whole lot of new. I think that she's like further arguing her idea that there within the singular there is this dimension that we have access to some emancipatory ethics without having to sacrifice our entire symbolic constitution in order to do so.
Yeah.
And in speaking about like Gegenstoss, what I had mentioned before about it, how it's sort of like this retroactive creation of like the place from which we have fallen. And she's basically arguing that rather than this being like a absolute radical loss, it's actually more like the most potent creative gesture, right? That like by giving design to that thing with which we no longer have a connection, we are actually like generating our subjective position, and that this is like an extremely powerful position to be in. And I agree, right? But my criticism here was that it seems to me that what Ruti is concerned with is how she can redefine a space for ethical action, which is good, but like what's so concerning is that the entire endeavor is that it's basically situated within the mind of the subject, or like within the subject's relation to itself. And that it's not concerned with ethics in like the Kantian sense, which has like no consideration of like how that's going to really relate to your personality or how you feel about yourself. Right. And like she's sort of trying to bridge that gap between how we can relate to ethics in the Kantian sense, which is like large scale, like how we exist ethically in the world, and have that somehow coincide with like our ability to relate to ourselves in the within our subjective own like content. I think that her project is more about people can act ethically. It's more about how people can act ethically and still be accepted by the society, and sort of maybe almost like, to invoke a like dangerous word here, to enjoy having acted ethically, which I think in a lot of ways sort of forecloses the horizon of when ethical acts require us to sacrifice that enjoyment. And so her theory ends up sounding a lot like what a defense of electoral politics sounds like to Marxists, right? Except it's about singularizing the subject for the sake of affirming their life. And so, and it's something like regular people need to be heroes. This is me on a big mad mode.
I was going to say, I feel like this might be a little bit of a straw manning of her argument, but do it.
And I admit it, but like this is what I wrote. It says it's something. Her argument is something like regular people need to be heroes too. In fact, being a hero has been within you all along, like et cetera, et cetera. And that her arguments are centered around the first world academic subject, despite her life affirming and freedom promising message seemingly being aimed at those who need more autonomy and confirmation that they have access to the universal, which in my perspective would probably be like the poor, the precarious workers, the working class, and not the people who are in the academy writing like their theories about all of history in the world. It's rather the people who actually find themselves in the position of not having access to the universal that she seems to be arguing for, or in a sense trying to invoke, but rather kind of presents it in this sort of first world. This is my big mad. On page 144, she literally talks about how shopping for shoes is a way of making the sublime present.
Oh yeah.
On 144, she just like goes through this whole. I mean, that's basically it. I think it's just like that. I found that to be like a way of reinforcing the criticism that I'm making here. On page 144, she's literally talking about like having gone for like shopping for shoes and how that like in a sense it's like the sublimity of like I don't know. And so
hold on a second. Hold on. Let me offer some thoughts from my notes in response to all your big mad energy here, comrade. So I mean, but she also is like kind of talking about the act of sublimation or the ethics of sublimation. I think like gets diverted in these two ways. One, she says that symptoms are sort of deformations or deviations of sublimation, but she also talks about false objects. And she says that these are objects that divert us into an illusory fulfillment through a diversion of what our actual desires are. I mean, she does say that commodities frequently have lost the last vestiges of Das Ding and betray its dignity, but commodities do have some element of Das Ding, which is why they capture us and enchant us so strongly. So I think like it's important to be like, she's not just saying like going to buy shoes as like encountering the Das Ding, but she's saying like, I think it's a nuanced position to say like, but obviously the reason why commodities hold us the way that they do, and the reason why like marketing and advertising is so effective through its use of psychoanalytic principles and like the developments of Freud is because they are capturing the way that like it can divert our like pursuit of like Das Ding in this like weird fucked
enjoy
up way.
Your symptom, right? And like I think, you know, once again, and in conclusion about like what I wrote in my note, it's not so much that she's highlighting this fact about commodities. I think that for me it was just like, look, we don't need to stretch Lacan as a theorist into like justifying our implications in capitalism's like false attempts to sate our material desires, right? Like yes, buying shit makes you happy. That's like an inevitable fact of like our implication with capitalism right now, but to make this a thing that Lacan is actually providing some justification for, or identifying on the side of what is actually emancipatory about our relationship to like how we're interpolated in society, is not something that I really think we have like a big need for, right? And
okay,
like
I
get it. In the sense that we might be arguing for the potential of like emancipation in the subject's relation to the signifier, but to stretch that and say like, and this is also why like we could see our like buying of commodities and our engagement with like the objects of like capitalism as like a kind of a version of that like malleability of the signifier. I'm like, nah, we don't need anybody to like further justify our participation in capitalism. Like even though it may have some kind of like efficacy as a metaphor, I just like in a sense felt like that's sort of a cop out. Like we don't need.
I guess I wouldn't read her as like justifying our participation in capitalism, although maybe she is. I guess like
I think it's just like she's engaging with subjects that find themselves to be in like a deep sense of failure in their own engagement with the world because they're sort of like enraptured with like their life with commodities and sort of like having superficial like motivations and like not really experiencing themselves as like the deep subjects of like ethics they probably expect themselves to be. And then she's kind of providing a ground for them to actually still relate to ethics, even though they are just like these, you know, like sort of betraying their responsibility to the world all the time. Their participation in capital.
Well, again,
so,
I mean, I think this
I get it,
like,
but I'm like, why? Do they need more? Do we need to stroke those egos more?
I just like, it's so interesting that you read it this way because like my read is not like her going out of her way to like stroke the ego of like the individualized capitalist subject, although I am willing to grant like maybe that's an implication of what she's doing. But I think this is like not too far off from like what McGowan's project is in our Capitalism is our reading series, to say like, listen, like the logic of the commodity so thoroughly structures everything that any way you engage with it is like somehow like reinforcing like the logic of the commodity, right? I just like read her as not like prescriptively saying like, oh yeah, like, well, you should engage in like commodities because like they do capture like some vestige of like the Das Ding. I just read her as saying like, listen, like this is a way for us to understand if we focus on Das Ding and the way that the signifier functions, that it gives us an insight into why commodities hold us the way that they do.
Yeah.
Like, which,
there's a quote here where she goes into it. I just want to bring it. It's at the on page 147. That's the last paragraph.
Oh yeah, I think I have this in my notes too.
Okay, yeah. She basically says, but there may not actually be any need for a new term given that, as I have demonstrated, Lacan's theory of sublimation is designed to communicate this very idea, namely that the sublime enters the world through ordinary objects and representations.
Yeah.
Ideally, this results in an enhanced capacity to find value in the minutiae of everyday life, and it illustrates how drastically Lacan's existential ethos, if I may call it that, differs from philosophies that place satisfaction beyond the world in some ultimate moral or divine good, for instance. Quoting that, I guess I just sort of like, my notes, I literally said, like, this is why I'm not a Lacanian, right? Or like, I wouldn't take on that label because I feel like it's a dimension in Lacan that just in a sense can be stretched in such a like radical like way that it just sort of starts to, when you start to look at all the different ways that Lacan is used to argue for all kinds of different shit, you end up seeing the ways that it just sort of becomes very much like Joyce becomes like this like empty signifier that can just be sort of stretched around whatever it is that you want it to be an argument for,
which we talked about is like
find that to be problematic, right? Like if you're gonna, the same way that like as an analyst in psychoanalysis in that practice, you have to like take a certain hard line on how you're going to interpret what your analysand confesses to you or like talks to you about. You can't just have this sort of vast malleability of like all the different ways that you're gonna like use your perspective to like stretch to fit a certain idea. Rather, you need to let the thing that you are observing formulate that idea for you in the sense that how you relate to the analysand is that, and not you jumping to make some certain kind of argument or have some certain kind of telos in what you're trying to accomplish in the subject, rather letting them argue it for themselves. The same way that like in our emancipation episode about like Lacan and emancipation, we were kind of trying to caution against in clinical practice for like analysts to like deny a subject that might be experiencing like a interest in like emancipatory politics or like a revolutionary ethics, like to just shut that down and say like, oh, you're just caught up in the images, like the wrong
like
approach.
Yeah,
right. That's you trying to stretch your theory into like causing the subject to be a certain way or another, rather than letting them get out of their own way to accomplish whatever it is that they're trying to accomplish in their life. Difference in ethics maybe, but like once again, you know, I've been big mad. I've been posing a lot of like criticisms to this book, but I think that in the end I'm like generally in agreement with Ruti. I like her argumentation. I just, you know, I think these things need to be brought up, because if there's anything to be criticized about what she's arguing for, it's this, that like she definitely has a certain perspective on the potential for violence, the potential for emancipation, and it's there. She's arguing for it, but she's like kind of trying to refocus things on a certain first world individualist or hyper individualist perspective that I don't know if it's as effective as she thinks it is.
I actually would agree with that. I think that one of the things that I love about Ruti but also frustrates me is I think that her critiques and like her approach is so valuable for emancipatory politics. It isn't necessarily what she seems to be interested in though. So I mean, I think that like we're coming up to the last couple of chapters, and I want to just like kind of sort of go over what she talks about as the ethics of sublimation, because that's really what she's getting to here, right, with like her approach to Das Ding. So the ethics of sublimation lifts mundane objects to the level of Das Ding. So ethics for her is not the subjective act of destitution, but keeping the gap open between Das Ding and everyday things with a lowercase t. So she does grant that there's some objects that paper over the gap of the traumatic loss of the thing, Das Ding, in a narcissistic way, but when coupled with the open-ended energy of the ethics of sublimation, it allows the pulse of the thing to exist in different objects or the same object at different times. And the more narcissistic our desire is, the less generate it is and tends to overwhelm and smother the object. I guess I just read her as saying the ethics of sublimation for her is ethical because it is driven by ever new ways to approach Das Ding and the objects or the everyday things, and by its very definition accepts the variability of the object. Like, it doesn't colonize the object, it doesn't smother it, it doesn't destroy it. It sort of always keeps this like relation to it open and flexible and malleable through the overabundance of the signifier, is how I read her. Okay. So yeah, I just want to like encapsulate that too, because I think that that's really the like core of this book, is really for her to say, okay, like what am I posing in response to like Badiou and Zizek and Edelman and all this, and like post-structuralist analysis, like some forms of like feminist and queer theory and critique. She's like saying it's ethics of sublimation, so here it is.
And I think, you know, I kind of, in my notes for this chapter, I basically was saying, if I'm to understand her correctly, she's basically trying to highlight a certain potential in the structural relationship between subject and this idea of singularity, that like it is specifically in that place of singularity that all these possibilities open up in the world. That sort of bursts forth with like that potential, right? Like we've been arguing this entire time. But then I also find that like in a lot of ways she's sort of claiming that our acceptance of a certain way of looking at things will necessarily disclose us from like all of the possibilities of that potential. And it just seems that both of those statements or those arguments of hers are kind of at cross purposes, instead of recognizing the way in which those ideas of like the opening up of possibilities are already encapsulated in the other thinkers that she's situating herself like in criticism of. She kind of tends to like sort of try to leave them behind in her leaping into the sort of potential for like the emancipatory potential of the signifier. Anyway, I just find that that's like it's like talking out of both sides of your mouth. She's like, accept the possibility that like there's malleability in ideas even when they are like the most oppressive and like foreclosing of ideas, but don't accept certain ways of thinking because it could also like foreclose these possibilities that you have access to. And then I was like, well, which one is it, right? Like, accept the ideas that you're presenting and see the possibilities, or am I possibly falling for, like the sedimentation that an academic is presenting to me and actually shouldn't listen to you at all? I don't know. How do you determine? It's like, once again, I think we get back to this question of like, is Marxism a science, right? Is analysis a consistent method? Yes, if you're a partisan. No, if you're not, right? Like there's all these discrepancies, and trying to present this from an objective perspective makes you fall into these pitfalls, right? You can't really argue for the scientific potential of Marxism if you're not a Marxist. And you can't really argue for the consistency of methodology in psychoanalysis, if you're not someone who subscribes to the very methodology that you're arguing for. So I think maybe that's what I disagree with here. My notes say, I think that this referring to like her ethical position kind of that she's been describing up until this point. I said, I think that this may be true for things like the enjoyment of your favorite baseball team's victory, but I don't think that it's true of things like eventual truth or like things that cause people to be in state of subjective destitution. That like, yes, all of that potential of like the signifier bending to like allow for your emancipatory gestures is there for like the everyday kind of like life world that we find ourselves in as like just shitty subjects of capital that don't really have a whole lot of access to maybe the beyond that we hope for, even though we're promised it all the time. There's potential there, but when it really comes down to like acts of like ethical, like eventual truth, like in the Bedouin sense or something, I don't know that you can then just like, I feel like this very same argument could be used for like a subject to like weasel their way out of like the fidelity to the truth,
sure,
and just be like, well, I could like imagine, like I can invoke the signifier's malleability here and like not be responsible towards this like moment of eventual truth at all, and just like squeeze out because I don't want to. The same way that like those tracks are always leading you to the wrong place, so. Well,
I think that's like in the end, right? Like maybe the short circuit between a perspective or an approach that like might make a lot of sense or might be very much around the, sitting on the couch, right, with your analyst and trying to make sense of like, well, how do I relate to like the hegemonic discourse and the other? Like, how does it help me make sense of my life? I mean, one of the things I do actually find really important and actually very deeply personally relevant and helpful is her discussion around there is a way that, let's say, not talking about constitutive trauma, right, just being a subject, but whenever you look at things around like the experience of trauma and abuse and violence, like the nature of those experiences is to destroy the ability to conceptualize the self in certain ways, or it like locks you into this like either a complete absence of like memory and language or whatever. And there is a certain way that like the malleability of the signifier is something that has to be used there as like a part of even just being able to make sense of that shit at all in the first place. I think that, like, again, for me, the short circuit comes down is like what you're talking about is precisely how you then decide what the political implications of this are.
Yeah.
And I think that that's where the short circuit comes down to me. And I mean, honestly, I'm looking at my notes and I'm kind of like, I don't know, I'm not even really sure how much else I want to say from the notes, because this to me is like really what it comes down to is like, for Ruti, I think she says that, for Zizek and Badiou, right, they talk about some sort of radical universal emancipatory subject, but their failure is the fact that like their own like limited engagement or, misunderstanding, or like she says, like it might be part of like sort of like their identities as like white men or whatever, is related to like their lack of engagement with things like post-colonial theory or queer theory, which are actually critiquing and asking the same questions they are.
Yeah.
And it's like, I think that like, sure, I think that's important to recognize. And at the same time, like coming away from Ruti's perspective, I can't help but say exactly like kind of what you're saying, which is like, yeah, okay, sure. Of course I can like, I'm my own individual, like personal experience of myself as a subject and how I'm going to make sense of my life and like trauma and the world. Sure, like knowing that the real and the symbolic relate more in the synthomatic way is profoundly helpful and like actually like really like gives me a sense of like freedom and agency in my life that I like would never have otherwise. Mm-hmm. I don't actually understand if I'm engaging with other people in a collective way, intersubjectively. Ruti doesn't necessarily help me make sense of how do I know whenever you're actually being fidelitous to your daemon or you are exactly skirting out of responsibility to the capital E event through invoking the malleability of the signifier. I don't think it will ever help you answer that. Right.
And she does mention that like the other is also like the domain of like an unreliable fucking background, so that it's like a faulty narrator almost to ourselves. That,
well,
like,
she talks
we assume
about
that it's in the other, but it actually isn't in the other either.
And I think that's why she like kind of invokes Emmanuel Levinas's like ethics of the face, and like it's the face of the other that's like the ethical injunction upon me, right? And I think that like there's a way she tries to talk about that, but in the end, it's I mean I'm not a fan of like Levinasian ethics either, so I'm not really sure I like buy that as like a substantial enough way to conceptualize like radical emancipatory subjectivity that is intersubjective and collective in just like this sort of framework that's being invoked. I think that's part of why the book, whenever it finally tries to talk about like multiculturalism and justice and like universality, I think kind of fails because its over-reliance on psychoanalysis as its framework solely, I just don't necessarily think is going to give you answers to those questions in the same way.
Right. Yeah, here's a quote at the top of 159. She's kind of talking about the other, and it's kind of a longer quote, but unless I am willing to, this is the quote, unless I am willing to entertain the dubious idea that there is, or should be, an autonomously viable pre-symbolic identity that is entirely my own, the idea that my subjectivity has been somehow defiled by my insertion into collective discourse cannot hold as a universal pronouncement. What, besides the real of the body, has the other / like big O other / little o other disrupted, violated, offended, or wounded? Is there some sort of pure I that has been corrupted by its encounter with collective discourse? While it is true that a specific subject can be defiled in specific ways by its relationship to the other, the belief that this relationship is intrinsically defiling overlooks the fact that it is this very other, big O and little o, that gives us access to the meaning-making capacities of language. That, more broadly, gives us the gift of sublimation. Yeah, once again, kind of reiterating that idea that like what we're seeing as like our defilement is actually the site of our ability to like emancipate ourselves.
I think that's also why she critiques the subjective act from destitution as being as radical as it proclaims itself to be. It's like because that act in its very self depends on the symbolic order in which it's like reacting against. I think that's part of her critique of some of like that position in Edelman and Zizek.
Yeah. And then I don't know, she was talking about like Dr. Phil and top of 163. So there's a moment here where I was like a little like my fucking eyebrows like were just like trying to pop off of the top of my head. But I got to try to find it here. Basically what I was highlighting about the top of 163 was that she kind of admits that like her project, even though the rushed pace of contemporary life makes serenity more and more impossible to come by, we are constantly warned against the pitfalls of anxiety, including the psychosomatic symptoms that it tends to spawn. These warnings are in fact so pervasive that it is hard not to feel anxious about feeling anxious. It is difficult to shed the suspicion that anxiety is the telltale sign of existential failure. Yet, assuming that we can rid ourselves of anxiety might be largely unrealistic. And to the degree that it propels our sublimatory achievements, suppressing it might rob us of some of our more vigorously inventive energy. And I feel like at some point she was kind of like confessing that like her project had started as trying to conceive of creativity without anxiety. I don't really know where she says that, but I have it written in my notes that that was like a thing that she was kind of arguing for, or that like she found herself in the predicament of like writing this book specifically as a result of like trying to understand what that creative process would be like without anxiety or something like that, which I was like, huh? Yeah. And then on the top of 165, she actually says something along the lines of like her idea of singularity is actually related to the concept of authenticity, which is when like my eyebrows like flew off the top of my head because I was like, oh, now, okay, here you go. But this is where the similarities end. This is at the top of 165, not least because I have underlined Lacan does not regard singularity, and then in quotations she has, or authenticity, as a matter of self-possession or self-ownership. And I just found it very odd that like at this point in the text, she's like using singularity and authenticity interchangeably in Lacan. And I was just like, whoa.
Do you think she was using it interchangeably, or she was just both like
trying
saying,
to
like,
emphasize the meaning that she was trying to, like trying to highlight a certain facet of the meaning of singularity?
Yeah, or passage. That like this is like that authenticity and singularity like both don't fit this interpretation.
Yeah, maybe. And
yeah.
I guess like my criticism of this whole section was just basically that like at the end of this all, there is a degree to which what she's advocating for like legitimizes like Dr. Phil's perspective in a lot of ways, that like this sort of like self-help collapsing of like what we're capable of doing when we engage with our like subjectivity. Yeah, in a sense, I feel like what, by comparison to all of the other, like, quote unquote, post psychoanalytic thought that she's engaging with, like, by comparison to all of them, she's absolutely on the side of Dr. Phil. And, like, I'm not trying to, like, minimize it. Like I said before.
I don't know if I agree with that, but, like.
No. But, like, she's pulling things in the direction of, like, how we can emancipate ourselves from the banalities of our everyday lives and like reinvigorate our motivation to like re-engage with our creative gestures or our like the emancipatory content of like our relationship to our own signifiers and like, or like the emancipatory form, maybe not in the content, but like anyway, at the end of the day, I was sort of like, yeah, if anything, you're pulling those theories in the direction of like how we are still subject to our desire, like subject to our responsibility towards das Ding in the like span of our everyday like engagement with our lives, even if in the most mundane like engagement we have with like commodities and like objects in our world. And so yeah, it felt odd that she was invoking Dr. Phil, but I think frankly after this, that's like all of that's like where my criticism ends. I think that like her chapter on the sublimity of love, which is like the final chapter before the conclusion, I basically found myself to be like totally and fully in agreement with. I felt like it was like a fucking champion way of like ending this text and like really bringing everything back to like what she's really arguing for, which I feel like is like a universalist ethics.
Of course. Yeah.
Let me see. Like
I will say too, I just read, I finished yesterday morning her book called The Summons of Love. That is like her whole book on this. And again, I would say like I think that the place where I think she is so good at what she does and where I think it really does shine through is actually in her discussion about Das Ding and the universal in the experience of love as an event. I think it's like one of the places where she is strongest in her writing and theorizing. And so I would highly recommend that book. It's also like, I mean, it's like 150 pages. It's like very short, very accessible, but it's basically like this chapter blown up into a full-length book.
I don't know if I should read this entire thing. I'm kind of trying to key in on a quote toward universalist ethics. Let's see. Okay, yeah, here we go. I'll just read the first little section of toward universalist ethics on 197. This is already in the conclusion, but I feel like it sums up a lot of what she was arguing for in the chapter prior.
I agree, yeah.
The truth event, as well as the process of elaboration that represents fidelity to this event, thus renders difference insignificant. She's referring to difference like in the multiculturalist sense. Difference insignificant by introducing a truth that is universally applicable to everyone concerned. However, this does not imply an erasure of singularity, for as we have seen, the subject of truth is always, by definition, an immortal, someone who cannot be subsumed into the unthinking mass of the collectivity. One might, in fact, say that only a person who recognizes him or herself as singular, in the sense of not being a part of the social category, can recognize the singularity and therefore the equality of others. And so I think that was just like a beautiful encapsulation of just like this entire concept and how it relates to ethics in the contemporary cultural situation we find ourselves in, right? At least with regard to multiculturalism, that was a great way of summarizing it.
And I think she also says too, and it's where she jumps from love to like justice and sort of like multiculturalism in the conclusion, is that, you know, for someone like Levinas, there's this way that the face of the other is this like set of like sameness or like shared sort of relationality. But for Lacan, the face of the other is the place of like terror and strangeness. You know, it's like a completely opposite way to read it. And I think that what I like about Ruti's approach here is that, you know, the universal is not like the side of where all distinctions and differences collapsed. It's like precisely the place where those are held in tension with the particularities. And I think that that's really the stakes of what we're talking about here. At the end of this, I think what Ruti is trying to describe is like, how do we talk about this Lacanian psychoanalytic perspective on the relationship of the particular to the universal? And like, who is it that gets to name the void at the heart of reality that is the event, right? Because that's like one thing about Badiou's conception of events is like they're always where the void or the negative is the thing that erupts into the social order. You know, it is the void itself that like creates the event. And I think that that's really what the implication here is that how do you in some way like sustain the negative in relation to the social order, which then like, you know, for her, maybe in its limited way, right, is still a way to talk about, you know, again, how do we make like the immanent and the transcendent like coextensive with each other? Yeah,
I think the last thing I really have written down, I mean, even since we're in the conclusion now, I guess, was just that I want to say that she really does, in her chapter about love and in the conclusion, really sort of redeem herself in my eyes. Even though I was like big mad throughout the entire book, I was like, oh, there it is. And I even told you, Comrade, when we first started talking about this book like a couple days ago or whatever, or like, it wasn't the first time we talked about it, but it was something that I like definitely was. I just wish that Ruti would have included a little bit of these like sort of larger conclusions, or like alluded to them in the beginning of the work, to like sort of show the way that like her criticisms weren't meant to like alienate or like distinguish her from these other thinkers, but rather were just like her way of relating to them, kind of, you know?
Sure,
and like,
sure.
I, you know, once again, you know, obviously we heard my criticisms throughout this whole thing, but she actually quotes Zizek in the conclusion. So I'm going to read
do it.
This quote that she has here. Yeah, so it's kind of a long quote, but try to follow. We should, this is Zizek that she's quoting in her concluding chapter. We should assume the risk of countering Levinas's position with a more radical one. Others are primordially and ethically indifferent multitude, and love is a violent gesture of cutting into this multitude and privileging a one as the neighbor, thus introducing a radical imbalance into the whole. In contrast to love, justice begins when I remember the faceless many left in shadow in this privileging of the one. Justice and love are thus structurally incompatible. Justice, not love, has to, I don't know why I'm saying commas. Justice, not love, has to be blind. It must disregard the privileged one whom I really understand. What this means is that the third is not secondary. It is always already here, and the primordial ethical obligation is towards this third who is not here in the face-to-face relationship, the one in shadow, like the absent child of a love couple.
You know what I love about this so much? How often do we hear now about these like bullshit appeals to evolutionary biology that, well, listen, after like 100 and something people, you actually can express empathy towards other human beings because they're not present. They don't fit into like our tribe.
Yeah.
And I think that this is exactly why I think you and I both cleave to like psychoanalytic stuff, despite not calling ourselves like Lacanians per se, but why this is so crucial, because it is the very act of the symbolic. It is the very way that our subjectivity is structured in this way that allows us to actually show that like what it is to be human is not to be collapsed to our biology, but is to exist as this like weird, undead sort of stain on reality itself, which allows us to actually hold the faceless others that we can never actually know or understand, that we can never relate to in this direct individual, like quote unquote tribalistic way, as actually the third that is always present.
Yeah.
And to me, that is exactly why this approach is so relevant for emancipatory politics, because outside of that, how are you ever going to get outside of the capitalist logic that, like, well, the only people you can ever really give a shit about are people that look like you, the people in your immediate community. It is only through this access to the universal that emancipatory politics is possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, yeah, it's almost like what we're sustaining is not biological. It's like specifically the non-biological that biology sustains, right?
Exactly.
And it's there because it can only benefit our fucking biology to like have the focus be shifted from the biological to the non-biological that
right.
biology exists to sustain. It's kind of like the chair you leave open for Stalin when you're having a meeting.
It is exactly like that. It is exactly like that.
Just in case he decided to drop by and join you, you know? And so, yeah, sorry to invoke Stalin.
I really love that that's where this has ended. It's just invoking, which I'm pretty sure we've made a joke about at least in 2, if not the 3 prior episodes of Real Late Night Philosophy / Psychoanalysis Hours, is always about what does the open chair for Stalin really signify?
Yes, and that we're answering that throughout all of these episodes.
Yes, that is really what we're trying to answer. It's like,
I was
what
like,
does
are
that
you
really
asking
mean?
me? I don't know. He might be here.
Well, I think it's kind of exactly what you said, right? It's this weird, like, stupid joke that Zizek tells, but what it's really getting at, and I think, like, what it is capturing is, like, what is our relationship as particulars, as fucking just, like, people trying to make sense of the world in our lives to the universal. And it's, like, and it's this weird thing where it's, like, it is, like, something is present to the degree that it is absent.
Yeah.
You know? And I think that that is, like, a really radical, like, counterintuitive idea, but it is exactly the one that we have to understand.
Grapple with here.
Yeah, grapple with if we really want to understand, like, what does a collective emancipatory subject mean? Because to be a collective subject, in the end, means that it always has to be, like, this sort of haunting presence of something that is absent. And to me, this is like the negation of the negation. It's the Aufhebung, right? It's like something is present to the degree that it's absent, and but it structures everything, you know,
right.
in a way.
Right. And there and like, you know, once again, that engagement with sort of like, yeah, toward the end, like on 209, you know, she's arguing that she's arguing against the idea that we can only be hurt by what we accept as like the thing that addresses us, right? You know, she's kind of saying that's how, like, that we should see the emancipatory potential in, like, invoking our singularity, right? But in a sense, it's kind of like, you know, I think that this redoubling of, like, recognizing what you're interpolated by and being able to recognize in that interpolation what about the interpolation was incorrect, or like
what it missed, right?
Yeah,
it always misses in
both its truth and its falsity. It's like extremely important. And so, you know, I kind of brought up this idea of like how Zizek just absolutely tries to like demolish this idea of like recycling or like organic apples and all this shit, right? Where he's always like, come on, like, is this really gonna fix the problems of like environmental catastrophe in our world? And it's like, absolutely not, but it makes us feel good. But in no way is that him advocating that we should abandon it.
Yeah, that we should like just not do
He's like saying like, you absolutely need to do your duty to this, like, to this domain of like ethical care for the earth, but you should also recognize that there's a futility in the gesture that is like actually more self-serving, right? And that he also, I think it's important to note, is that like in the discussions about empathy and like subjective ability to like relate to one another and kind of talking about this third that's always already present in their absence, right? Zizek's like prime example of like true solidarity between subjects is like specifically the way that you can completely tear each other apart, in the sense that like how you relate to each other is like through insults and like excremental like associations, and just like really relating to if you have a true comrade, there's like a degree to which you always are engaging with like their impossibility of being relatable ethical subject, right? That like they're just always monstrous in their presence, and therefore you can sort of highlight or like get at the truly impossible connection that exists between you, right? Because if you're able to reduce the other to like their excrement, then it is obvious to both parties involved that like there is something that exists beyond their excremental self, right? To invoke your blog.
The pro podcaster move right there.
Read Adam's blog, His Excremental Self. But like, yeah, I think at the end of the day, in order to be able to like relate to an other, there has to be a degree to which you can engage with their excrementality. And that all that it can possibly serve to do is like bolster the sense in which you value them beyond what they are.
Almost like
You know?
it is through that very act that one then like makes like the immortal, the transcendent, coextensive with the immanent, right? It's like, oh
Yes.
yeah, like you cannot be collapsed to just these immanent aspects of yourself. There is something like, I love in you what is more than you, right? And that is exactly what I think happens in that moment around like love, around solidarity, around comradeship, around true empathy, is always that way of like, you know, I love that monstrous element in you precisely because like that is this thing that like gives you your particularity, right? It makes you singular. And I think that there's a way that, again, like just understanding how this relates to emancipatory politics is like the whole fucking name of the game.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, this is like my final thought, to be honest, but like every time I found a failure of emancipatory politics or true radical revolutionary sort of potential has always been whenever we actually cannot relate to each other with both of those things being coextensive.
Yeah.
You know, it has always been whenever we collapse everything to the interpersonal, right? Or that like we completely dehumanize each other because we're only in the service of an ideal. Like I think that like we have to be able to
like hold all registers in mind at once.
Yeah,
right? Like
dialectically relate all of them together. I think that that's like, it's difficult, but you know, as Zadie Spinoza says, like things are as worthwhile as they are as difficult and rare, you know? And I think that that's the thing. Like that's what the name of the game is for me as far as I'm concerned. And it's why we have to read shit like this and disagree with it and critique it and push it further than it's willing to go.
Yeah.
Because that's the stakes that we have to operate on, right? I mean, like the exact failure to actually coalesce something is like, yeah, related to structural, historical, material conditions, but there's what Gramsci called the subjective factors, that if we don't have those and we're not thinking about those, we're going to miss whatever potential there is for the event to erupt, right? And so I think to me, like that's kind of why reading Ruti is so relevant and important to me, because it at least gives me a way to think about the subjective factors in a way that I think is really crucial, but also has to be like, again, pushed, right? And critiqued.
Yeah, man. Yeah, I think we pretty much covered it here. And like once again, like despite my big mad energy, at the end of this this work, I was like actually like in high singing her high praises. I think I just need a little more of this like last couple of chapters towards the beginning so that I could have like unclenched my butthole throughout the entire experience. But yeah, you know,
well, and
in a sense, right? Isn't it that she is doing this exact thing, like this sort of like humiliating gesture, this like obscene way of you know, that occurs between true friends, right? This like sort of like daggers out approach that she's taking towards Zizek, Badiou, Butler, like even Santner, that she like generally agrees with. Like everybody got the fucking dagger, and in a sense, this is how she is sort of like finding the solidarity with that post psychoanalytic thinkers,
post psychoanalytic thinkers. Yes.
Yeah, I don't know. Do you have anything else?
I'm good. I'm toast. That's almost 4 hours of Mari Ruti.
Yeah, bro. We hit it hard, real late night. Now it's actually late night.
Now it is late night. It's literally the sun has changed radically its position in the sky in relation to us.
Yeah, man. That gravity, man. Gravity of the fucking singular.
All I heard was John Mayer just saying, gravity.
Yeah, gravity. That fucking meme that was going on for a while where it's like, it's working. And then that's it. You know, like, yes. And it's just like people falling down.
Yeah. I love it. We go out on a meme the way we should for 2020.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
All right, glorious comrades across the globe, that is a wrap for 2020 here in the Red Library. I just want to say one last time how grateful the entire Red Library crew is, myself, all the Comrade Commissars, all of us across the Lost Horizons network for your support, your solidarity, all throughout this year. It has been a hell of a ride, and in a lot of ways, being able to do this show, to put it out each and every week, has been one of the saving graces, I think, of all of us. It's helped us get through this year, and hopefully we've been able to return the favor a little bit by helping you feel connected to others, to challenge yourself, to push yourself to think, to feel in new and different ways, to define and redefine what it means to be radical and revolutionary, to seek for emancipation precisely in conditions where they feel most furthest away. We will see you back in 2021 as we tackle new works, engage in new collaborations, have new guests, push ourselves and our thinking even further for all of us. Because that's what Red Library is for us. It's political education for today's left. And we're here to push boundaries in every possible way that we can. In the meantime, take care of yourselves, stay safe, stay radical, and know that your comrades here at Red Library, we out here. Peace.